Hello, my dear friends. Victorian women could be electrocuted for showing desire. Some died after being cured with medicinal wine. Some were tested for virginity in front of servants, then sent back to their mothers' homes if their sheets weren't stained with blood. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was the system, a society where silence was considered a virtue and pain was a necessity. Tonight, you're going to join me in a world where women were controlled until their last breath and still had to smile as if everything was fine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into a Victorian home, it would be clear from the beginning that women lived under a constant watch. From the moment they were born, daughters were told that their value depended on their purity. Virginity was treated as proof of worth, almost like a certificate that decided their place in society. Parents, neighbours, and even strangers acted as if they had the right to judge a girl's character simply by whether she was still untouched. Schools and churches repeated the same lesson until it was engraved deeply into young minds. A girl's future, her chance to marry, and the honour of her family were all balanced on something she could neither show nor explain. It is almost ridiculous that society reduced the worth of a woman to a single physical condition. But in Victorian times this was not questioned. In classrooms, silence was taught as discipline. Teachers avoided any discussion of sexuality or desire. If a girl dared to ask a question about her body, she was quickly silenced. Curiosity was treated as rebellion, and rebellion was punished. Families supported this culture by enforcing modesty in the home. Mothers warned daughters to avoid temptations without ever explaining what those temptations were. Fathers expected obedience and would never tolerate discussions about intimate subjects. The result was a generation of women who learned that even their thoughts could be dangerous. To wonder was to risk shame. To speak was to risk punishment. Marriage was not an escape from this burden. When a young woman married, she carried with her the same silence. Husbands expected compliance, and often assumed that their wives should not show any sign of pleasure. Wives were told that intimacy was a duty, not a choice. A woman who expressed enjoyment could be seen as immoral or unfaithful. Instead of being a partnership, marriage often became another stage where women performed obedience. They were wives by law but strangers in their own homes, unable to share their real feelings or desires. If we compare this to today, it would be like telling people they must eat every meal without ever being allowed to taste it, insisting that food is only fuel and any sign of enjoyment is shameful. The rules of virtue also shaped appearance. Clothing became a form of restraint. Corsets pressed into ribs and restricted breathing, while layers of heavy fabric made movement difficult. Fashion was not about beauty alone, it was about control. The less skin a woman showed, the more she was praised for her decency. Dresses reached the ground, sleeves covered arms, and collars were tightened around the neck. Even in the privacy of their own homes, women were expected to remain covered. Underwear was designed in a way that made access easier for husbands, but prevented women from touching their own bodies. Every stitch reinforced the idea that their bodies did not belong to them. At social gatherings, reputation was everything. A daughter's behaviour reflected on her entire family. A misplaced laugh, a bold glance, or a conversation that lasted too long with a man could start rumours. Families guarded their daughters' actions as though they were guarding treasures. Mothers reminded girls to sit properly, speak softly, and avoid drawing attention. Fathers watched carefully, ready to intervene if they believed a line had been crossed. Women lived with the constant awareness that someone was always observing them. Their lives were built on performance, and one mistake could cost them their future. Religion reinforced these pressures. Sermons spoke of purity and warned against sin. Desire was painted as a dangerous fire that would destroy a woman's soul. The church taught that good women were passive, patient, and silent. The only acceptable passion was for prayer. Any sign of bodily longing was linked to weakness or evil. This message was repeated so often that many women began to believe that their own feelings were unnatural. They learned to fear themselves as much as they feared judgment from others. Doctors also played their role in this system. Women who showed signs of desire could be labelled as sick. Medical texts spoke of hysteria, a condition supposedly linked to an unstable womb. The very idea that a natural human feeling could be classified as illness shows how deep the fear of female sexuality ran. This medical control supported the social one. Women were kept ignorant, then told their confusion proved they were unwell. It was a cycle that silenced them further. I find it difficult not to feel unsettled when imagining how many lives were lived under these rules, with women carrying burdens they could not name and suffering in silence. Within families, the silence was strongest. Mothers often repeated the lessons they had learned, passing down warnings without explanations. Daughters grew up with fear but no knowledge. Fathers remained distant, speaking only of honour and duty. Brothers and uncles joined in the policing, believing they had a right to protect family reputation at any cost. Women lived surrounded by walls of morality built by those closest to them. Their bodies became symbols rather than living, feeling parts of who they were. The result was a society where women learned to hide not only their desires, but also their pain. They dressed carefully, spoke carefully, and even thought carefully. Fear shaped every choice. A girl who questioned too much risked being seen as ruined before she had even lived. A wife who showed warmth risked accusations of indecency. To survive was to remain silent, and silence became second nature. Over time, it was not only their voices that disappeared, but also their understanding of themselves. Virtue, as defined by society, became a chain that tightened with every passing year. This so-called virtue was less about morality and more about control. It allowed families to present themselves as honourable, husbands to claim authority, and institutions to keep women obedient. The cost was carried by women alone. Their health, happiness, and humanity were sacrificed to maintain appearances. What was praised as dignity was, in reality, another form of oppression. For many women, endurance was the only path left. They learned to bear the weight quietly, believing that silence was their duty and obedience their destiny. The silence was strict and heavy. Women were kept from knowing even the simplest facts about themselves. The next step was an education built entirely on fear and ignorance. Sexual knowledge in Victorian society was not passed down to women through books or lessons, but through silence. From childhood, girls were raised to avoid thinking about their bodies and to treat curiosity as shameful. The rules were strict and unspoken, but they governed every household and every school. If a girl asked about the changes in her body, she would likely be scolded or ignored. Teachers considered it improper to address such subjects, and parents saw silence as protection. What this produced was not purity, but confusion. Women were expected to live under rules they did not understand, rules that followed them into marriage and beyond. It is almost laughable that ignorance was treated as a moral achievement, but this was exactly how the culture defined virtue. In schools for young ladies, subjects like literature and religion filled the timetable. Anatomy was never mentioned. Lessons about health stopped at vague advice to be clean or modest. Girls were never told how their bodies worked, and anything connected to desire was deliberately hidden. The belief was that knowledge itself could corrupt. To speak openly was to plant dangerous thoughts. Silence became a form of control, repeated in classrooms and in family parlours until it was second nature. Teachers avoided details, mothers passed on warnings, and daughters were left to wonder in fear. No system existed to prepare them for adulthood. Inside families, the same rules applied. Mothers told daughters not to be curious, fathers emphasized honor, and siblings watched one another closely. Any question about intimacy was quickly labeled indecent. Even medical advice was limited. Doctors often refused to explain symptoms to female patients, choosing instead to speak to husbands or fathers. Women were kept in ignorance, not only about their bodies, but also about the very words that described them. Many grew to adulthood without knowing how children were conceived. This ignorance was considered a sign of innocence. Families were proud when their daughters appeared completely unaware. If we compare this to today, it would be like sending someone into a dangerous factory without training, insisting that not knowing how the machines work is proof of good character. Marriage revealed the cruelty of this system. Brides often entered their wedding nights with no idea of what would happen. They were told to submit, to remain quiet, and to endure whatever came. Shock, fear, and even physical pain were common, but women had no language to describe it. They were not allowed to admit confusion or distress. Husbands, shaped by the same culture, expected compliance and mistook ignorance for virtue. Many women left those first nights frightened and ashamed, yet unable to speak. They returned to their families with smiles, hiding their fear to preserve appearances. What was celebrated as a sacred union often began with trauma disguised as duty. For those who sought answers, there were few places to turn. Books on sexuality were banned or hidden, and even medical texts were kept from female readers. Some women tried to piece together knowledge through whispers with trusted friends, but secrecy was always dangerous. A woman caught discussing such matters could be accused of indecency. Neighbours gossiped, reputations were ruined, and chances for marriage destroyed. Knowledge became not just forbidden, but threatening. Women learned that safety meant staying silent. Their bodies changed, their lives changed, but they remained locked out of understanding. Doctors contributed to the cycle of ignorance. Many refused to explain conditions in plain terms, insisting that women were too delicate to hear the truth. Instead, they offered vague reassurances or unnecessary treatments. Some illnesses were even blamed on women's own curiosity. Female patients were told that asking too many questions was harmful to their health. The medical profession supported silence, reinforcing the idea that women should not and could not know. This left countless women suffering in confusion, believing their ignorance was natural and their pain was personal failure. I find it striking that a society so proud of science denied half its population the right to basic medical knowledge. The effects of this silence spread beyond the home and the clinic. Women grew up without the ability to protect themselves from abuse or exploitation. They did not know the boundaries of consent because those boundaries were never defined for them. Many became victims without understanding what had been taken. When pregnancies came, they were often unplanned and unexplained. Mothers prepared daughters for housework but not for childbirth. Pain and fear were endured without question, because to question was considered improper. A woman could give birth to several children without ever being told how her own body functioned. This was not seen as cruel at the time, it was seen as proper. Society celebrated this ignorance as proof of female virtue. Writers published guides for men that praised wives who were quiet and uninformed. A wife who knew nothing was a good wife. The cycle repeated across generations, locking women into silence that was called morality. Even as science advanced in other areas, women's bodies remained a subject hidden behind shame. To many Victorians, this was not a problem but an achievement. A woman who did not know was considered safe. A woman who asked was considered dangerous. The silence reached into every corner of life. Girls were trained not to notice themselves. Young women were married without preparation, and wives endured without explanation. What began as a form of protection turned into a form of control. Knowledge was withheld, and the lack of knowledge was praised. This was not accidental, it was deliberate. It kept women dependent on fathers, husbands, and doctors. It left them unable to make choices about their own lives, bound by rules they were never allowed to understand. In this silence, control was maintained, and women carried the cost alone. The cruelest part was how ordinary it all seemed. Parents, teachers, doctors, and priests all believed they were doing the right thing. Women were told they were fortunate to be sheltered from dangerous knowledge. The very thing that harmed them was presented as protection. The contradiction was invisible to those who upheld it, but painfully clear to those who lived under it. Silence was not safety. It was a cage disguised as care, and once inside it, few women could escape. The pattern was consistent across society, but its effects were most visible in the moment of marriage. When women finally faced the reality of intimacy, they did so unprepared and unsupported. The shock was profound, the silence unbearable. Yet even then, they were expected to smile, to endure, and to remain grateful. This cycle of ignorance and fear passed from one generation to the next, shaping countless lives with quiet cruelty. The silence was not simply tradition, it was power. By keeping women uninformed, society kept them obedient. Knowledge was treated as a threat, and silence as a form of control. The result was a world where women lived without the right to understand themselves. They were kept from the truth, and that absence of truth defined their entire lives. The silence was strict and heavy. Women were kept from knowing even the simplest facts about themselves. The next stage of control was through clothing and the very fabric they wore each day. Corsets and heavy layers of clothing were not simply fashion in Victorian society. They were tools of control. Women were expected to wear garments that shaped their bodies into narrow ideals, no matter the pain. The corset pressed against ribs, restricted lungs, and forced posture into rigid lines that matched society's definition of virtue. Breathing became shallow, movement limited, yet complaints were rare. The corset was praised as a symbol of dignity, while in reality it left women bruised and exhausted. It is almost comical that fainting from lack of air was treated as elegance, but that was how the culture measured refinement. Each garment carried meaning beyond its fabric. To be covered was to be moral. To show less was to be virtuous. Dresses reached the ground, collars tightened around the neck, and sleeves stretched to the wrists. The more a woman was hidden, the more she was praised for her purity. It was not only modesty, but also a clear message that the body was not hers to reveal. Every added layer became another reminder that appearances mattered more than comfort or health. If we compare this to today, it would be like making workers wear heavy metal suits every day just to prove their loyalty, no matter how difficult it was to move or breathe. Even under these layers, there were further signs of control. Undergarments were designed in ways that offered access to husbands while preventing women from exploring themselves. Open crotch drawers were common, a design not for comfort but for surveillance and authority. Women were denied privacy even in the most intimate spaces. The clothing itself reinforced the message that their bodies were available for others, but restricted for themselves. I find it deeply unsettling to imagine living daily life wrapped in fabric, meant to remind me that my body is not my own. The pressure to conform was immense. Magazines praised the latest corset styles, shops advertised new fabrics, and society rewarded those who obeyed the rules. Women who dressed less formally were criticised as careless or indecent. Every step in public became a test of morality, measured by how tightly one's body was bound and how completely it was hidden. Even at home, daughters were watched and guided to wear clothing that emphasised restraint. Fashion became an education in silence, teaching girls to carry the weight of expectation with every stitch. The physical effects were undeniable. Doctors recorded cases of deformed ribs, damaged lungs, and weakened muscles. Yet many dismissed these problems, claiming women were naturally frail. The truth was that clothing made them frail. Hours spent laced into rigid corsets left bodies aching. Heavy skirts dragged with each step, forcing women to move slowly. The image of grace and poise was built on suffering that few admitted aloud. To faint in public was not seen as illness but as charm, another sign that the system had twisted pain into performance. For wealthier women, the pressure was even greater. They had to display elaborate gowns at social events, with multiple layers of silk, lace, and velvet. Servants often helped them dress, tightening corsets and fastening countless buttons. Every event required hours of preparation, leaving little time for comfort or individuality. Clothing was less about self-expression and more about proving one's place in society. Poorer women, though spared the heaviest gowns, were not free from these expectations. Even working-class women were urged to wear some form of corset, no matter how impractical it was for labour. The standards of virtue reached across classes, binding every woman in some form of fabric prison. The symbolism of clothing was powerful. A tightly laced corset was more than a fashion choice. It was proof of obedience. Families took pride in daughters who wore them without complaint. Husbands expected wives to present themselves properly dressed at all times. Communities judged women by how well they followed these rules. A loose dress or an unlaced corset could spark gossip, leading to suspicion about morality. Clothing became a silent language, one that women had no choice but to speak. In private moments, some women resisted. They loosened laces at night, removed layers when no one was watching, or avoided the most restrictive styles when possible. But these acts were small and dangerous. To be caught could mean accusations of indecency. The system left little space for rebellion. Even comfort was seen as a kind of failure. The weight of expectation followed women everywhere, from crowded streets to quiet bedrooms. To live within Victorian clothing was to live under constant control, measured by stitches and steel. What made it worse was how normal it all seemed at the time. Society accepted that women should suffer for dignity. Magazines, doctors, families, and friends all reinforced the same message. A woman who struggled was told to be patient. A woman who complained was told to be silent. The burden was personal, but the rules were universal. Every day began and ended with the ritual of dressing, a ritual that reinforced submission in the most physical way possible. Corsets and layers were not accidents of fashion. They were deliberate instruments. They shaped not just the body but also behaviour, making women walk carefully, sit straight, and act with restraint. The restrictions of fabric trained them to move within limits set by others. The body became a symbol of discipline, bound tightly enough to erase freedom. The result was a life where even breathing was an act of obedience, hidden beneath the appearance of refinement. Women lived their entire lives under this weight, told that it was a privilege to be shaped into ideals they had no voice in choosing. The clothing they wore every day reminded them that society valued control over comfort, appearance over health, and obedience over individuality. This was not just fashion. It was another form of silence, another way to make women conform without words. They dressed in layers that controlled movement and breath. They wore garments designed to restrict them while pleasing others. Soon, even doctors would claim that a woman's natural desires were an illness to be treated. Victorian doctors often described female desire not as a natural part of life but as a disorder. Women who showed signs of wanting intimacy, or even those who were considered too emotional, could be labelled as sick. The medical system created names like hysteria to explain behaviour that did not fit the expected mould of silence and obedience. Once a woman was given this label, she became a patient rather than a person. Her feelings were treated as symptoms, her body as an object for correction. It is almost absurd that the most basic expression of humanity was turned into a medical problem, but this was the common view of the time. Hospitals and private clinics became places where such treatments were carried out. Instead of offering explanations or support, doctors prescribed harsh methods. Among these was the use of electrical currents, applied directly to women's bodies under the claim of therapy. Electricity was new and fascinating to many Victorians, and so it carried an air of authority. Patients were told that it would balance their nerves, restore order, and calm the mind. In truth, it left women shaken, frightened, and often injured. The treatments were painful, but silence kept them hidden. Few women dared to speak openly about what they endured. The medical justification was rooted in fear of female independence. If a woman showed desire, she was seen as unstable. If she sought more than silence, she was said to have a wandering womb or overactive nerves. Doctors wrote long texts about these supposed illnesses, reinforcing the idea that women were too fragile to control themselves. Families trusted these diagnoses, sending wives and daughters into treatment rooms. What began as social control was given a mask of science. In practice, it was another form of punishment, cloaked in medical respectability. The procedures themselves were invasive. Women were strapped into chairs or placed on tables while electrical devices were applied. Some were told to endure for their own good. Others were not told anything at all, simply expected to comply. The current caused muscles to spasm, bodies to jolt, and minds to panic. The supposed goal was to reduce desire, but the outcome was often trauma. If we compare this to today, it would be like taking someone to a clinic for being hungry and shocking them with electricity to cure their appetite. The aftermath was severe. Many women left treatment more anxious than before. Some developed depression. Others experienced lasting confusion. Cases were recorded of women who lost the ability to function normally after repeated sessions. Yet doctors rarely questioned their methods. Success was declared if a patient became quiet, withdrawn, or subdued. The silence of women after such treatment was taken as proof of effectiveness. In reality, it was fear and damage, not a cure. The system rewarded results that aligned with control, not with healing. Families often cooperated in this process. Husbands who found their wives too passionate could consult physicians, who would recommend treatment. Parents who worry about their daughter's behavior could do the same. The woman herself had little say. Her role was to obey, just as in every other part of life. Hospitals became extensions of the household, enforcing the same rules of silence but with harsher methods. Trust in authority kept the cycle alive. Few dared to challenge the word of a doctor. The rise of these treatments reflected broader attitudes toward technology. Electricity was modern, powerful, and mysterious. Its use in medicine seemed progressive, even when applied cruelly. Newspapers sometimes praised it as a miracle cure, fueling belief in its legitimacy. What was hidden were the stories of women who suffered in silence, their lives altered by experiments they never consented to. The fascination with progress allowed cruelty to pass unnoticed. Science was praised, but women bore the cost. For the women themselves, the experience was terrifying. To be taken to a clinic, stripped of choice, and subjected to shocks was not only painful but humiliating. They were told their natural feelings were shameful and then punished for having them. The treatments reinforced the idea that their bodies were not theirs. Instead of finding comfort, they learned to fear medicine itself. Many avoided doctors afterward, even when genuinely ill, because of the trauma. Their silence ensured the cycle continued. Doctors defended these practices by claiming success. They pointed to patients who no longer spoke of desire or appeared subdued. They ignored the long-term damage, both physical and emotional. The absence of protest was counted as proof. This distorted logic allowed the profession to continue unchecked. The women's suffering was invisible, erased by the authority of medicine and the power of silence. Families accepted the results because they aligned with what society demanded. A quiet woman was a moral woman, no matter the cost. This approach also revealed the hypocrisy of Victorian ideals. Society praised morality, dignity, and discipline, yet relied on violence disguised as treatment. Women were told to embody purity, and if they failed, they were punished under the guise of science. The contradiction was clear, but few acknowledged it. What mattered was maintaining appearances, not protecting lives. The suffering of women was hidden beneath claims of progress, just as their desires were hidden beneath layers of clothing. I find it chilling to imagine the quiet hallways of those clinics, where the hum of electricity was considered the sound of healing, while in truth it was the sound of cruelty. The practice of electrical treatment for desire was not isolated. It was part of a larger system that defined female sexuality as dangerous. Doctors, families, and institutions worked together to maintain this belief. Women were not only denied knowledge but also punished for natural instincts. Their bodies became sites of experimentation, justified by authority. The system was not about health, but about control. It taught women that their feelings were unacceptable, their resistance meaningless, and their voices powerless. Some women never recovered from these treatments. Depression, confusion, and even permanent mental decline were recorded. Yet these outcomes rarely reached the public. Failures were hidden, while successes were exaggerated. The silence of victims kept the illusion alive. The harm became another unspoken truth of Victorian life, buried under layers of respectability. Progress was celebrated, but only at the expense of those who could not speak for themselves. Women were told their desires were an illness. They were strapped to tables, shocked and silenced. The cruelty did not end there, as medicine soon offered other invasive treatments that claimed to cure women by touch. Marriage in Victorian society carried with it rules that were never written but always enforced. A woman was told that her duty as a wife was to provide intimacy whenever her husband wanted it, but she was never allowed to see this as her own source of joy. To enjoy was to transgress, to feel was to fail. The act was stripped of tenderness or connection and placed firmly within the framework of obligation. A wife could show patience, silence, and submission, but never pleasure. It is almost absurd that showing happiness with one's husband could be considered immoral, yet this was the expectation in countless households. From girlhood, women had been prepared for this role. Mothers told daughters that marriage meant service, not satisfaction. Religious instruction reinforced the same message, preaching that a good wife gave herself without question. The result was that when women married, they entered a space where silence was demanded not only in words but in the body itself. To move too much, to sigh, or to show delight could be judged as indecent. Husbands might even complain that a wife was too eager, fearing it suggested corruption. The paradox was cruel to give was required, but to enjoy was forbidden. This contradiction was accepted as ordinary. Inside the home, this unspoken law shaped daily life. Bedrooms became places of quiet endurance. Wives did not speak of their discomfort, nor of any curiosity they might have felt. They turned inward, training themselves to show nothing. Many adopted the belief that their lack of pleasure was proof of virtue. Women who admitted otherwise faced gossip and suspicion. Manuals published at the time even advised wives on how to remain still and silent, presenting it as a mark of refinement. If we compare this to today, it would be like advising people to eat every meal while keeping a straight face, forbidding them from enjoying the taste, and punishing them if they admitted to liking food. Husbands held authority not only over when intimacy occurred, but also over how it should be experienced. If a wife resisted, she could be accused of neglecting her duty. If she showed too much interest, she could be accused of indecency. Within this narrow path, women were left with no safe way to exist. The law itself did not recognize marital rape, and force was often justified as discipline. Wives had no legal protection and no right to refuse. The balance of power was entirely against them, written not in statutes but in expectations and reinforced by silence. The family home became another extension of social control. This burden was not only emotional but physical. Women were told to remain passive, even if it caused pain. The lack of knowledge about their own bodies only made matters worse. Many suffered injuries or infections but were unable to speak of them. Doctors, when consulted, often reinforced the same ideas, suggesting that silence and obedience were proper cures. The cycle left women in distress but unable to find comfort or recognition. The act itself became another chore, not unlike cleaning or cooking, except it came with the added weight of shame. I find it profoundly unsettling to imagine lives where even the possibility of joy was turned into a reason for blame. Religious authorities supported this unwritten law. Sermons praised wives who submitted and condemned those who sought pleasure. Desire was painted as a dangerous fire, especially in women, who were considered naturally more prone to temptation. To restrain desire was praised as strength, but only when it was a woman doing the restraining. Men were excused, forgiven, or even encouraged, while women carried the burden of silence. This double standard became a cornerstone of Victorian morality, one that shaped not just the home, but also the wider society. Women bore the stigma, while men bore none. The social consequences were heavy. A woman known to show too much warmth could be whispered about. Rumours could spread quickly, damaging not only her reputation but also that of her family. In a culture where appearances were everything, this risk was enough to keep many silent for life. Manuals and books continue to reinforce these fears, presenting obedience as the highest female virtue. A wife was taught to mask her feelings, to live as though her inner world did not exist. She could be devoted and faithful, but she could never be fully human in her own right. For the wealthier classes, these expectations were enforced through constant observation. Servants saw and reported, families judged and gossiped. A wife's behaviour was scrutinised at every turn, ensuring that no hint of passion escaped. For the poor, the rules were the same, though they lived in different circumstances. Silence and submission were demanded across every class. Women who could not comply risked violence or abandonment. There was no safe space, no alternative path. The law, religion, and custom all aligned to ensure compliance. This created a society where women were trained to separate body from self. They learned to exist as providers of duty while erasing their own feelings. Some accepted this role, believing it was their fate. Others carried quiet bitterness but never spoke. The absence of conversation meant that generations repeated the same experiences. Daughters learned from mothers not through words but through silences, through hints and warnings that reinforced the rule. The cycle was strong because it was unspoken. What was never questioned was never changed. The cost was profound. Women lived in marriages that denied them intimacy, trust, and partnership. Instead, they lived in structures of control disguised as morality. They bore children without choice, shared beds without joy, and carried silence as their constant companion. The very act that could have been a source of connection became a reminder of subjugation. Appearances were maintained, reputations were preserved, but lives were diminished. This was the hidden cruelty behind the curtain of domestic respectability. Marriage was supposed to be the foundation of stability. Instead, for many women, it was the foundation of silence. The rule that wives must not feel turned homes into places of endurance rather than comfort. The law and religion both supported this, leaving women trapped in expectations they could not escape. In this silence, control was complete, and the possibility of happiness was carefully erased. It is almost laughable in its cruelty that a society so concerned with morality built its rules on denying women the right to enjoy their own lives. Wives were told not to feel, not to want, not to show. Their bodies became sites of duty, not of joy. The medical profession soon offered explanations for this silence, inventing conditions like hysteria to frame women's struggles as sickness. Victorian medicine created strange definitions to explain women's behaviour and health. One of the most common was hysteria, a diagnosis so broad that nearly any complaint could fall under it. Women who felt anxious, tired, or restless might be told they were hysterical. Those who spoke too much resisted authority, or showed desire were given the same label. The condition became a convenient explanation for anything that society disapproved of in women. The supposed cause was even stranger. Doctors claimed that the womb could wander through the body, pressing on organs and nerves and creating illness. It is almost laughable that a moving uterus was blamed for fainting, sadness, and desire. But this was accepted as science at the time. The idea of a wandering womb was not new, but in the Victorian era, it became especially popular. Medical texts described the uterus as unstable, a kind of restless organ that needed control. If a woman were unhappy, doctors might say her womb had shifted. If she felt desire, they could claim the womb was pressing against nerves. Even symptoms like headaches or back pain were blamed on this wandering. The explanation was vague, but it was repeated so often that families believed it. Husbands sent wives to doctors, convinced that medicine could restore order. Instead of addressing social pressures, doctors made the body the problem. Treatment reflected these beliefs. Since hysteria was linked to the womb, doctors focused on it directly. Some prescribed rest cures, confining women to bed and restricting movement. Others recommended cold baths, tonics, or controlled diets. But one of the most common treatments was genital massage, performed in clinics under the guise of medical therapy. Women were told it would calm their nerves, balance their bodies, and relieve symptoms. In reality, it was another form of control, performed without clear consent and often misunderstood by patients. If we compare this to today, it would be like a doctor treating anxiety by shaking a patient's hand for an hour and insisting it is scientific. The popularity of hysteria as a diagnosis meant that countless women were subjected to these treatments. Records show that middle-class and wealthy women were especially targeted, since they had more access to doctors. For poorer women, the diagnosis still appeared, but treatment often took the form of crude advice or cheap tonics. The message was the same across all classes. Women's problems came from their bodies, not from the society that constrained them. This deflected attention away from the pressures of silence, obedience, and restricted roles, placing the blame squarely on women themselves. In clinics, the atmosphere was clinical only in name. Women lay on tables while doctors performed what they called therapy. They were not told the real purpose, nor given the choice to refuse. For many, the experience was confusing. They believed they were receiving legitimate treatment for an illness. Doctors, meanwhile, framed the outcome as proof of their methods. Women left feeling unsettled, unsure, but expected to return for more. The cycle reinforced dependence, keeping women tied to medical authority. Some doctors even built their practices around this single treatment, advertising themselves as specialists in women's nervous conditions. The strange part was how normalized it became. Newspapers and journals occasionally mentioned hysteria as if it were a genuine epidemic among women. Entire books were written describing its symptoms and cures. The medical profession supported one another, rarely questioning the diagnosis. The result was an enormous system built on shaky ground, with women's lives at its centre. The fact that so many accepted this shows how powerfully culture shaped medicine. What should have been questioned was instead repeated until it sounded true. I find it disturbing that the suffering of women was turned into both a business and a spectacle, justified by ideas that had no real basis in science. At home, families accepted the diagnosis with little doubt. Husbands brought wives for treatment, believing it was their duty. Mothers encouraged daughters to obey doctors, even when the methods were uncomfortable. The authority of medicine carried more weight than the voices of women themselves. Patients were often silenced when they tried to express doubt, told they did not understand their own condition. The irony was sharp. Women were judged for being too emotional, then denied the right to speak about their emotions. Medicine claimed to offer solutions, but in practice, it only deepened the silence. The spread of hysteria as a diagnosis also reflected fears about women gaining independence. As more women sought education, wrote books, or demanded greater rights, society reacted with suspicion. Doctors described these women as nervous or unstable, using hysteria as a way to dismiss their ambitions. A woman who wanted freedom could be labelled sick, making her easier to control. The diagnosis served as a tool not only for health but also for politics. It reinforced the idea that women belonged in the private sphere, quiet and obedient, rather than in public life. The consequences were lasting. Women subjected to repeated treatments often developed deeper anxiety or depression. Some became dependent on visits to clinics, convinced they were ill. Others avoided doctors altogether, fearing further humiliation. The culture of silence meant that few spoke openly about their experiences. Their confusion and pain remained hidden, buried beneath layers of respectability. For many, hysteria became not just a diagnosis but a life sentence, shaping how they were seen and how they saw themselves. Victorian medicine claimed to advance science and knowledge, yet in the case of women it relied on superstition and control. The wandering womb was never proven, hysteria was never defined clearly, and the treatments were invasive rather than helpful. Still, the system endured because it served the larger purpose of maintaining social order. By framing women's struggles as medical problems, society avoided facing its own cruelty. The body became the scapegoat, while silence kept the truth hidden. Women were told their wombs wandered. They were diagnosed with hysteria for feelings they could not control. The next stage of treatment would involve even stranger practices, as doctors claimed their hands could provide the cure. The treatment that Victorian doctors offered for hysteria often took a form that today is almost impossible to believe. Women were told they were unwell, that their nerves were unstable, and that their wombs required medical attention. The solution, according to many physicians, was a procedure they called massage. It was performed by male doctors, carried out in clinics or private offices, and presented as a respectable medical service. Consent was rarely explained, and women often had little idea what was happening. They were told it was therapy, and so they endured it. It is almost absurd that such intimate acts were justified as medicine. But in Victorian times, this was accepted without question. Doctors described the procedure in medical terms, claiming it would release tension and restore balance. They did not speak of pleasure, nor of intimacy, but of health. Women who underwent the treatment were told their symptoms would ease afterward. If they felt calmer, it was seen as proof that the method worked. The procedure was repeated as often as doctors prescribed, sometimes weekly, sometimes more. Clinics began to specialize in this therapy, turning it into a routine practice. Women came in quietly, submitted, and left again, carrying the confusion of being both patients and subjects of something they did not fully understand. The lack of consent was striking. Women trusted doctors because they had been taught that medical authority was beyond question. Families encouraged compliance, husbands often supported the treatments, and society believed it was progress. Few women dared to speak against it, since questioning a doctor could bring shame. They were left to assume that whatever was done in the clinic was necessary. In reality, the treatment blurred the line between medicine and exploitation. If we compare this to today, it would be like a mechanic convincing customers that breaking parts of their car was a normal step in repair, and people accepting it because the mechanic wore a uniform. Doctors themselves defended the practice openly. Medical journals printed articles describing the procedure as a cure for hysteria. Some even detailed the steps, turning something deeply personal into technical instructions. The language was clinical, but the meaning was clear. These men claimed authority over women's most private experiences and framed it as science. Patients were reduced to cases, their feelings ignored. What mattered was the performance of medicine, not the dignity of the women who endured it. Many women were told to return regularly for sessions. The treatment was described as necessary maintenance, like tending to a chronic condition. Patients who resisted were warned that their symptoms might worsen. This cycle created dependence. with women tied to doctors who profited from their return visits. For some physicians, the steady flow of patients became a reliable source of income. Clinics expanded, advertisements were placed in discreet ways, and the practice became part of the medical landscape. The system rewarded the doctors, but the women paid the price. The emotional impact was rarely discussed. Women left appointments confused, unsettled, or ashamed. They were told they had been treated for illness, but many could not understand why it required such methods. Some believed they had been helped, others felt violated, yet silence kept them from speaking. To question was to risk being seen as improper. The culture of shame ensured that experiences stayed private. The silence of countless women allowed the practice to grow without challenge. Technology even played a role. As demand for treatment increased, some doctors turned to devices that could speed up the process. Early vibrators were developed not as tools of intimacy but as medical instruments. They were promoted as innovations, saving doctors time and effort. Women continued to be treated, still under the belief that this was medicine. The line between science and exploitation blurred further, masked by claims of progress. I find it disturbing to think that an entire industry was built on women's confusion and silence, treated as if their suffering was a market to be served. This system thrived because it aligned with the broader rules of Victorian society. Women were denied knowledge about their bodies, told their desires were illnesses, and left dependent on authority. The treatment reinforced all of these points. It silenced them further, kept them ignorant, and placed control in the hands of men who claimed to be healers. The fact that it was accepted so widely shows how deeply the culture of obedience had shaped everyday life. Medicine did not free women from silence, it deepened it. The practice also reveals the hypocrisy of the era. Victorians prided themselves on morality, restraint, and progress. Yet behind the closed doors of clinics, women were subjected to invasive procedures disguised as science. Society looked the other way, preferring to maintain appearances. The cost of this hypocrisy was carried by women alone. Their lives were shaped not only by silence at home, but also by silence in medicine. The pattern repeated, reinforced by authority, until it became ordinary. For women, the experience was another reminder that their bodies were not their own. They were told they were ill, that treatment was necessary, and that compliance was expected. Their voices did not matter, their consent was not sought, and their understanding was ignored. Medicine, which could have been a source of relief, became another form of control. The harm was hidden, wrapped in clinical language, and passed down as normal. The silence that defined their lives was never broken. Even in the spaces meant for care, doctors framed the procedure as a cure. Families trusted the authority of medicine. Entire clinics began to appear, offering these treatments as their main service. Across Victorian London, private clinics began to advertise themselves as specialists in treating women's illnesses. The illnesses were rarely defined, usually collected under the broad label of hysteria, but the treatments were very specific. Male doctors, claiming authority and science, performed manual procedures on women who had been told their nerves or wombs were unstable. Families trusted these clinics, sending daughters and wives to appointments without question. Women entered believing they would receive care, but what they received was invasive and confusing. It is almost laughable that pressing hands against patients could be called modern medicine. Yet this was promoted as science in one of the most advanced cities in the world. The number of clinics grew quickly. Demand was high because hysteria was considered common, and nearly every woman could be diagnosed with it. Newspapers printed advertisements written in careful, respectable language. Doctors described themselves as experts in women's nerves, as healers with new techniques to restore calm and health. Behind these words, the treatment was always the same. Women were touched under the guise of therapy, told it was necessary, and asked to return for regular appointments. In many cases, the frequency of visits created steady business for the doctors. What began as individual cases turned into entire practices built on this one service. Women who attended these clinics often had little choice. Husbands or parents arranged the appointments, convinced it was for their well-being. Once inside, they faced authority figures in white coats who spoke of health, but offered no explanations. Procedures were performed without clear consent. Patients were left confused, some feeling better temporarily, others feeling ashamed or violated, but all of them kept silent. To question the treatment was to risk being labelled sick or indecent. The balance of power was entirely with the doctors, who held both social and scientific authority. If we compare this to today, it would be like a bank convincing customers that signing blank checks was the safest way to protect their savings. The business of treatment became lucrative. Clinics charged fees for each session, and many patients were advised to return weekly. This made the therapy profitable, encouraging more doctors to establish similar practices. London became dotted with these establishments, some hidden in quiet streets, others openly advertised in medical directories. For the medical profession, this was progress and success. For women, it was another layer of control, now disguised as commerce. Their suffering was turned into a steady income stream, accepted by families who believed in science but did not question its methods. Inside these clinics, the atmosphere varied. Some were furnished like respectable medical offices with desks, instruments, and books. Others were little more than private rooms rented for the purpose. In all of them, women were reduced to patients whose bodies were considered objects of treatment. Doctors kept notes, recorded visits, and spoke of outcomes. But the women's own voices were missing from the records. They were subjects of observation, never partners in understanding. Their experiences remained silent, hidden behind the official language of medicine. The women themselves often carried confusion. Some described relief from their sessions, others left feeling unsettled. None were given the knowledge to interpret what was happening to them. They were told their nerves required therapy, their wombs needed calming, and that the doctor's touch was the cure. In a society where women were denied education about their own bodies, this explanation sounded reasonable. Ignorance was exploited as a tool of compliance. The fewer women who knew, the more easily they accepted what was done to them. I find it difficult not to feel disturbed when imagining women entering these rooms with trust, only to leave with silence covering their confusion. Medical journals rarely criticize the practice. On the contrary, some published articles describe the technique in clinical terms, treating it as an important advancement in gynecology. Doctors praised one another for their skill, further legitimizing what was happening behind closed doors. The profession created its own echo chamber, reinforcing the idea that this was legitimate care. The silence of women and the authority of men combined to make the practice almost untouchable. What might have been questioned in another context became accepted as ordinary. The clinics also reinforced class divisions. Wealthy women could afford frequent sessions in well-furnished establishments, while working-class women attended cheaper, rougher clinics. In both cases, the treatment was the same, but the surroundings differed. The universality of the practice showed how deeply ingrained it had become. Across social classes, women were told their bodies were unstable, and across the city, they were subjected to the same procedures. The message was clear: female desire and independence were to be managed, and medicine was the tool. Some women did find temporary relief, if only because the procedures offered attention and recognition they rarely received elsewhere. But this did not erase the underlying problem. Their confusion remained, their ignorance continued, and their dependence grew stronger. The cycle tied them to clinics, reinforcing the authority of doctors while erasing their own autonomy. This was not treatment in the true sense, but repetition of control under a different name. The growth of these clinics marked a turning point. What began as scattered treatments in individual offices expanded into a network of practices across London. Women came and went quietly. their presence accepted as normal. Families discussed appointments without shame, believing it was medical care. Doctors built reputations and fortunes, while women endured. The silence around the practice made it invisible to wider society. Only by looking closely can we see how deeply it shaped women's lives, turning their bodies into sites of commerce as well as control. The clinics are spread across the city. Doctors promoted them as centres of healing. Women kept returning, convinced by authority and restrained by silence. Control over reproduction in Victorian society was framed not as a right for women, but as a moral battleground. Within marriage, wives were expected to accept pregnancy as naturally and endlessly as it came. The idea of preventing conception was seen as dangerous, even sinful. Any attempt to interfere with reproduction was judged as rebellion against duty. Women had no recognised authority over their own bodies, and decisions about childbirth were left to chance, to husbands, or to harsh judgment from society. It is almost absurd that the same society that praised order and discipline refused to allow order within women's own lives. Contraception was not entirely unknown, but it was heavily condemned. Condoms, for example, existed and were sold discreetly, yet they carried a stigma. Men might use them in secret, but if a woman suggested their use, she risked being labelled immoral. Condoms were connected with prostitution, not with respectable marriage. A wife who mentioned them could be accused of indecency or infidelity. The message was clear. Respectable women accepted their fate, while only fallen women sought to control it. This double standard created silence within households. Husbands made decisions quietly, and wives endured whatever followed. Abortion was treated even more harshly. Women who attempted to end pregnancies faced legal punishment, social disgrace, and often physical danger from unsafe methods. Families disowned daughters, communities whispered, and the law pressed charges when cases became public. The risk was enormous, yet some women took it out of desperation. Poverty, illness, or fear of another child drove them to seek solutions outside the law. Many did not survive the procedures. Their deaths were hidden, treated as private shame rather than social tragedy. If we compare this to today, it would be like punishing people for refusing unsafe drinking water, insisting they must consume it no matter the risk to their lives. For many women, the lack of choice meant endless cycles of childbirth. Mothers raised large families not by desire but by obligation. The physical toll was immense. Repeated pregnancies weakened bodies, increased the risk of complications, and often ended lives early. Women bore the pain in silence, praised for their endurance but given no relief. Their role was reduced to reproduction, framed as both sacred and unavoidable. The irony was bitter. The very act that could bring life also brought exhaustion, suffering, and death. Yet society refused to question it. Doctors and religious leaders reinforced these beliefs. Sermons declared that preventing conception was an offence against God. Medical texts warned of moral decay if families limited their size. Husbands and wives were told that large families were a sign of strength and blessing. The cost to women's health was ignored. The emphasis was on duty, not on well-being. Women's silence about their own needs became another marker of virtue. The fewer complaints they made, the more they were praised. The cycle continued, supported by institutions that valued obedience over survival. I cannot help but feel a heavy sadness when considering how many women lived and died without the chance to decide for themselves. Among the poor, the situation was even harsher. Poverty made large families nearly impossible to support, but options for control were almost non-existent. Women worked long hours, cared for children, and faced pregnancies that threatened their survival. Some turned to dangerous herbal remedies or untrained midwives, risking their health in secret. Others abandoned children when desperation grew too strong. Society condemned these women as criminals, ignoring the conditions that forced their choices. Respectable voices blamed immorality rather than poverty, keeping the burden entirely on women's shoulders. In wealthier households, silence persisted but with different expressions. Wives endured pregnancies as part of their role in preserving family lines. Some used discreet means of spacing children, but always in secrecy. Conversations about contraception were rare and dangerous. Even when doctors offered private advice, it came wrapped in warnings and judgment. Respectability required silence, and silence kept the system intact. The privilege of wealth softened some consequences but did not erase the lack of autonomy. Women across classes lived with the same absence of control, bound by rules they did not choose. The broader culture treated reproduction as proof of morality. Large families were admired, while smaller ones drew suspicion. Women who failed to have children were pitied or scorned, as if their worth was tied only to fertility. Those who resisted were cast out entirely. Literature and advice manuals reinforced the same ideals, praising patience, obedience, and silence. Wives were reminded that their role was sacred, even if it meant pain and risk. The absence of conversation about alternatives ensured that nothing changed. Generation after generation repeated the same cycle. The fear of social disgrace was powerful. Women knew that if they sought to end or prevent pregnancy, they could lose everything. Reputation was fragile, and one rumor could destroy it. Communities watched closely, ready to judge. This pressure ensured compliance, making silence feel like the only safe choice. Women learned to endure quietly, even as their health declined. The combination of law, religion, and community created an unbreakable cage, with reproduction at its center. This unwritten law shaped not only private lives but also public policy. Discussions about contraception or abortion were suppressed, framed as dangerous to society itself. Reformers who tried to raise the issue were silenced or ridiculed. The taboo became so strong that even basic education about reproduction was denied to women. Ignorance was enforced as morality, keeping women in roles that benefited everyone but themselves. The result was a system where silence and suffering were treated as natural, even noble, parts of womanhood. Women carried this burden with little recognition. Their endurance was praised, but their pain was invisible. Their bodies became symbols of morality, controlled by rules they did not write. The absence of choice defined their lives, shaping families, communities, and entire generations. The cruelty was disguised as virtue, and the silence was mistaken for peace. In reality, it was control, maintained through fear and enforced by institutions that left no room for resistance. Women were denied the right to prevent conception. They were condemned if they sought control, and punished if they refused their role. In the face of this silence, books appeared that claimed to guide wives on how to endure their husbands without question. Victorian society produced countless manuals that claimed to guide women in their roles as wives. These books were published with respectable covers, often decorated with religious symbols or moral slogans, but their content reduced marriage to a lesson in endurance. Women were told not how to build companionship, but how to remain silent. The instructions were blunt and repetitive: do not resist, do not speak, and do not show discomfort. A wife was expected to serve without hesitation and to hide any pain she might feel. It is almost absurd that entire books were written to teach women how to pretend not to suffer, yet these works were praised as wisdom. The advice often began with the idea of duty. Marriage was described as a sacred bond, and within that bond, a wife was reminded to put her husband's needs first. Writers told women that their role was to give, not to question. If intimacy was painful, they were advised to mask their expressions. If they wished to refuse, they were told to suppress the thought. The goal was not mutual connection, but the preservation of appearances. A quiet wife was considered virtuous, while a woman who admitted discomfort risked being labelled disobedient. The silence was enforced through printed words, reinforcing the same lessons taught in families and churches. Many manuals included specific instructions on behaviour. Women were told to remain still during intimacy, to avoid any movement that might suggest active participation. They were warned against speaking or making sounds, even if in pain. Some texts went as far as suggesting that wives should thank their husbands afterward, regardless of their own experience. The tone was firm, presenting these directions as moral truths rather than opinions. To ignore them was framed as failing both husband and God. If we compare this to today, it would be like publishing guides that tell workers to smile while being injured on the job, insisting that suffering is a sign of professionalism. The audience for these manuals was broad. Middle-class women were expected to read them as part of their education, and wealthier families often gave such books as gifts to new brides. In this way, the advice became ritual. A young wife entered marriage with her trousseau, her household linens, and her